Otávio, you will have 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor for some questions. So, without further ado, the floor is now yours.
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, Luis and Christian, for organizing such a terrific conference. It's been really stimulating and a lot of fun. So also, for me, it's always a pleasure to come back to Mexico City. I love this place. And so when Luis said, well, I was actually in Oaxaca last month, and said, well, would you come again? Of course, anytime. So that was, and it's been great. So I really appreciate it. So today, what I'm going to be doing is suggest at least one way of thinking about what logical pluralism can be, right? And so now often the view is presented, right, as a claim that there is more than one correct logical consequence relation. We saw yesterday Axel complaining about some inadequacy of this way of thinking about it. And at least in the way that J.C. Biel and Greg Rasto formulate that, and we're going to see a little bit of the details quickly in a moment, it's flesh out in terms of model theoretic devices and quantification over cases, right? Now, Rosanakiev, several years ago challenged, I think very interestingly, this way of thinking about logical pluralism. And she set up a dilemma against the viability of that view. She focused in particular, on the pluralist by cases, but also extended her considerations beyond that. Right. So what I would like to do is something I've been planning to do since I read the paper 10 years ago, which is think about, okay, I need to offer a response, right? And when I got the invitation to come here, challenge to logical pluralism, oh, that's perfect. Now I have finally my excuse to go back to Rosanna's paper and think about what would be an alternative, right? I'm going to see the sorts of considerations that you raise, and I'm going to sketch the way I think about logical pluralism, which is very different from J.C. Biel's and Greg Rasso's in terms of domains and modal properties of those domains. Work that I've done with Scott Chalkovsky in many papers. And I would like then to see how that can be defended, right? And hopefully also independently motivated, right? So it's not just a sort of ad hoc defense. Let's see how it goes, right? So now, briefly, let's just lay down the two versions of logical pluralism that are at stake here. One of them, so Biel and Rasto version, right? We saw, already discussion of that yesterday, right? We have what's interesting about their view is they offer a sort of unified approach, right? So there is something that brings together the various logics, and what brings together is that notion of logical consequence, spell out in terms of the generalized Starsky thesis, right? An argument is valid, provided that in which in every case in which the premise is true, so is the conclusion, right? And what counts as the cases, right? That's what these are the shifting features. They assume that the framework in terms of situations, right? So depending on the kinds of situations we're considering, we get different cases, right? If you had consistent and complete situations, we get Tarskian models. Basically, we get classical logic. The situations are consistent and incomplete, we get things that will be appropriate to some constructive logics. If they are inconsistent and complete, we get things appropriate for a very consistent logic, right? So, because this is the bare bones of the view, far more needs to be said. But let me just highlight two worries that I have. And those are worries that prompt Scott and I to move away from this way of thinking about logical pluralism and move to the modal version. One is, if we take seriously the idea that every case, right, in which the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. What will happen is, well, if it's every case, we need to consider situations that are consistent and inconsistent, complete and incomplete, right? And so there is a sense in which the view is cherry picking. You're selecting some cases, right? And for those, but the question is, well, then you're not quantifying overall cases, right? And of course, if you do quantify overall cases in that sense, well, then there's nothing satisfied validity. And we get logical nihilism. End of story. I think that's bad, right? The other concern is it's not obvious how to get certain logics out of this framework. So, for example, how quantifying over cases, you get quantum logics, or non-reflexive logics. These are logics in which identity is restricted, right? And I think, well, I pressed that to Greg, and he said, well, we're pluralists, but we're not trying to account for every sort of logic. So, well, then you're not pluralist enough, right? You need to do better, right? And so that's the way in which then Scott and I said, okay, let's find a different way, right, of trying to formulate the view that hopefully does better, right? And the idea here is actually you go back to the notion of validity. I think JC and Greg are right that that's, central notion in logic, that pluralism should, be spelled out around this notion, right? What I think the mistake was flesh out that notion in model theoretic terms, right? I think that straitjacket their way of thinking about logical pluralism. So instead of that, and in any case, given the sort of limitations of any model theoretic representation, right? So for example, if you want to talk about logical consequence for set theory, right, in model theory, presumably the domain of quantification should be all sets, right? What do you want? All sets in which but there is no such thing if your model theory is consistent, assuming classical logic, right? So that's a big artifact of the whole approach. So what you need is have a notion of consequence that is not tied to a particular representational device, right? And we do have a notion of consequence like that, right? In fact, when Aristotle invented logic, the notion he had of consequence was a modal one, right? It was not model theoretic. It was not a matter of truth preservation. All of those things are very, very recent in the history of logic. It was actually a modal notion, right? So that doesn't talk about truth, doesn't talk about truth preservation, right? None of that. It's a matter of managing possibilities, right? What you do not want in the case of a valid argument is a situation in which the conjunction of the premises and the negation of the conclusion is possible. Well, if that happens, something got wrong, right? So an argument is then valid if the conjunction of the premises and the negation of conclusion is impossible. Right? Now you may say, "Oh, okay, what is impossibility here?" Right? Again, don't think about possibility a lot, Lewis, right? In terms of possible worlds, right? Again, I think that artifacts about that way of thinking about possibility that are highly problematic, right? So, for example, if you think about the entire logical space of worlds, right? You ask the question, okay, why is it that we don't have there worlds in which some contradictions are true? Right? Well, they're not possible. Well, but in making that claim, which is what you want to say, right? You're actually talking about a modality that it's not world-bound. You're talking about a modality about the very structure of the logical space. That requires a notion of modality that is not available for the modal realist, right? You're not reducing it to what happens in a world, right? Now, there are attempts to fix this, advanced modalizing, John Divers' moves on this. They unfortunately are, thank you, that's very kind. Unfortunately, they are very ad hoc, right? So I don't think that those moves work. This is a topic for a different discussion. But what the idea here is, there are good reasons then to think about these possibilities as being primitive, right? Even the modal realists, despite the reductive tendencies ultimately need a primitive notion of modality to make sure that the structure of the logical space is just right? So, well, in that case, just assume a primitive notion of modality. When I'm talking about what's possible or impossible, I'm not here talking about what's true in a world. I'm not talking about what holds in a set of propositions. All of those are reductive approaches to modality. All of them fail. All right. So the idea here is, well, of course, crucial for this account is that there is a logical space, right? A space of what's possible, right? Of course, we don't know all the possibilities in that logical space. That's something we find out, right? So, for example, there are modal properties in objects in the world. This table is fragile, right? Very sturdy here, but if an elephant decides to sit on top of it, it will break, right? This is a modal property that the table has, as much as its length, right? Its weight, right? Even its color, right? The idea is think about particular domains as having objects with their properties. That will constrain what's possible or not in that domain. And also, what will happen is a logic would allow us to express these possibilities. So if some of those possibilities are complete and consistent, sure, we get exactly what classical logic are, right? If they are incomplete and consistent, we get exactly what constructive logics would say. If they're complete and inconsistent, we get paraconsistent logic. But we can go beyond that, right? If they are incomplete and inconsistent, right, we get non-alethic logics, right? They're both paraconsistent and constructive, right? But those are just a few, right? You can actually, if you start thinking that, now what matters there is what's possible in the domain, you have a whole range of logics that would naturally fit into the framework, right? So in that way, we can avoid, the sort of nihilism. Why? Because particular domains will constrain logics appropriate for them, right? And there will be validity there, right? In those domains, the inferences will go through. They may fail elsewhere, right? In that sense, the idea that there is one logic that holds across the entire thing goes through the window. In fact, that's one of the things we learned from the developments of non-classical logics throughout the 20th century, right? And but the fact that you don't have one principle, one set of logical principles that holds across the entire domain doesn't mean that there aren't specific domains in which they do hold, right? And for those domains, often more than one logic would be appropriate. So also, what will happen is, depending on the domains we're considering, you can have quantum logics about those are domains in which distributivity fails, right? No reflexive logics would involve possibilities in which identity does not hold. So let me briefly illustrate those things, right? So you have a sense of the kinds of things I have in mind, right? This is an example I love to give. Some of you have already seen in other contexts, right? There are cases in which, by considering properties of particular empirical domains, we realize that some logical principles fail, right? So, and quantum mechanics is a really interesting case. Suppose we are interested in non-relativistic quantum mechanics, right? So, and that's how, traditionally quantum logics first being uncovered, right? So, and one of the things that became clear there is that the classical logic's distributivity of the conjunction over disjunction fails. How? So, here's how, right? You have a feature of non-relativistic quantum mechanics. We can call this spin principle, right? In a given direction, y, in that case, right? There are only two possible outcomes for the measurement of the spin of an electron. Either it's up, right? Or it's down. That's what we have in that notation there, right? And we have also a version of Heisenberg's uncertainty relation, which means basically it's not the case that in two different directions, x and y, the spin of the electron can be measured with having values, right? The idea being once you measure the spin of electron, you disturb the system, so you can also measure this simultaneously in a different direction, right? In fact, that's how Heisenberg ran. So it's a sort of an epistemic version of the principle. Bohr hated that, said, oh, this is a metaphysical, even though it's that term, but ultimately said, that's the nature of those particles, right? They're essentially indeterminate, right? And it's not an epistemic point. That was not Heisenberg's view, but okay. Leaving that aside, in fact, Bohr made Heisenberg add, almost a little postscript after, in the original paper in 1927, he uncovered those things, saying, well, look, yeah, maybe this is the nature of those things, and so on. Okay. All right. So, assuming those things, okay, these are coming just from non-relativistic quantum mechanics, right? So now we are in the lab, we prepare the setup, and we make a measurement. Now, this is something that holds empirically. In the x direction, right, the spin of that electron is up. Okay, that's true empirically. Now we are, by assumption, working with classical logic. So if classical logic holds, conjunction introduction is something that we can do, provided that both conjuncts are true. Well, they are, right? One is empirically true, and the other one is just our good old spin principle. All right, we're all excited. So, okay, now we're going to apply distributivity over those because that holds for classical logic. When you do that, is what happens, right? So when you distribute, you get, the folks over here, this is true. This spin principle, it's also true. When you distribute, what will happen is, hey, I have the measurement of a spin is the electron in two different directions. That violates Heisenberg principle. So we just violated distributivity. Okay? So, and in that way, so this is an illustration of how you can actually be forced to revise empirically some law of logic. Of course, you may say, you're not obliged to do that, right? You may say, no, I'm a committed classical logician. So much the worse for quantum mechanics. All right? That's what Bohm did, right? He said, okay, forget about the Heisenberg uncertainty relation. Let's get a decent formulation of quantum mechanics, right? And he did. In fact, the Bohmian mechanics look as much as classical physics that you can in the quantum world, provided that there is such a thing called the quantum potential. Trouble is, there's no evidence for this thing, right? So, of course, Bohm would like, had he found the evidence to actually undermine quantum mechanics. Given that there was no evidence there, it became just an interpretation of the theory, right? But you can go that way and hold on to classical logic if you want. However, if your goal is to, I want to understand quantum mechanics, the non-relativistic one, as it was formulated, well, then you're not messing up with the spin principle or the Heisenberg uncertainty relation. In that case, distributivity goes, and that's how quantum logics got uncovered. Features in the domain, right? Possibilities, what can or cannot hold in the domain, are constraining what sorts of logics that you can then employ to express those relations adequately. Okay, that's one example. A second example comes also from quantum mechanics. This is a case of non-reflexive logic. So these are logics for which the principle of identity is restricted, right? And now, this is, led to a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. Schrödinger had it, File did it as well. And the idea is the following. There's a principle in quantum theory that says if we have two, let's say, electrons, right, in the same state, and they swapped around, the state they are in doesn't change. So, and then you say, well, how can that be, right? Because if you have a similar situation in classical mechanics, that would change the state, right? If you have a red ball here, a white ball there, and you swap them around, well, it's not the same state, right? So it's being changed. And so the thought was, well, these things, electrons, don't have identity, right? The thought is you cannot say, this is Mike, this is Ike. So there's no alibi for an electron, as Vio would say, right? So, and because there is no way of tracking those things, right? The state remains the same. Lack of identity would account for that feature very naturally. So here's the situation, and that would change the probability assignments. they will make for quantum mechanics, right? So in classical mechanics, suppose you have two states and two objects to be distributed over them, right? So you may say, look, we have these two objects, A and B, in one state, none in the other. You can think vice versa, or you can have one in one state, the other in the other state, or swap them around. If each of these possibilities has the same probability, then the probability of each case is 1/4. So far, so good. Now, we do something similar in quantum mechanics. What we get is something different. First, because there's no way of individuate these electrons, you cannot say this is A and this is B, right? Even this labeling requires some form of distinguishability, and they are not, right? Okay, so you have two of them in one box, none in the other, vice versa. And then you have only one other option, one in one state and the other in the other, because when you swap them around, nothing changed. So in that case, if each possibility has the same probability, you get a different probability, 1/3, right? And that's empirically supported, right, by experiments with quantum mechanics, right? Again, another illustration of how thinking about a particular domain, you may actually have to revise, in that case, the principle that identity applies to all objects. The idea is not to say that electrons are not self-identical, right? You have to be inconsistent to be like that, right? The idea is, on this interpretation, identity doesn't apply to them, okay? All right. So I hope, of course, there are lots of further things she said about this. I'm just giving you a flavor of the view so you have a sense of how I'm thinking about this domain modalist version of logical pluralism. All right. One final comment about the setup. Connection between logical pluralism and relativism, right? So I think it's important to distinguish. Of course, there are many different kinds of relativism. I'm going to distinguish two here, which will be relevant for the discussion. One, we can call a tolerant relativism, right? This is the one that says the logical consequence is relative to something. Languages, domains of inquiry, context, you name it, right? I think this is a straightforward form. In fact, I think this is true about the logics we have, right? And it's unproblematic, right? Of course, relativism often gets a bad press, particularly in philosophical circles, so no one wants to say, I am a relativist, right? And but there are forms of relativism that I think it's okay to say, yeah, I'm a relativist in that sense, right? Now, this is one, right? Now, there's a radical form of relativism that I think is far more problematic in the context of logic, right? There's no independent standard to determine whether a logical consequence relation can be applied or not, right? That would be bad, right? Because at that point, anything goes. It looks like, all right, you just pick and choose whatever logic and you're fine. That would be terrible, right? That relativism, certainly, I do not want to endorse, right? Now, it's very interesting. Not even the weak form of relativism, Bio and Rastow are willing to entertain, right? They explicitly deny them. Presumably, they would also deny the strongest one, right? And so, in fact, they say, we do not take logical consequence to be relative to languages, communities of inquiry, context, or anything else, right? So they, not even the weak one, they are willing to go for, right? I think it's as long as the weak one doesn't entail the strongest one, we are fine, right? Actually, I don't think it does. I'll give reasons for that in due course, right? And since I do think that the logical consequence is indeed relative to a particular context, well, I don't have any problems with, as opposed to JCB and Greg Russell, to embrace tolerant relativism, right? That's another difference between the approach Scott and I favor and theirs, right? So I do think that tolerant relativism is ultimately innocuous. All right. Having set things up, now let's look at Rosanna's challenge, right? It's a multi-pronged challenge, right? She focused in particular on the pluralist by cases, although not exclusively, and I'll have an opportunity to say something about that, right? And on her view, logical pluralists have not succeeded in showing how there can be multiple radically different consequence relations, right? clearly, without establishing this plurality, logical pluralism cannot get off the ground, right? So the whole view obviously cannot be that way. Right? So central to Rosanna's case is a particular realist assumption about logic, right? That there is a true logic, a logic that when applied to the world yields a true logical consequence relation. An assumption that presumably is also shared by Biot and Rastel, right? Of course, for them, there is more than one true logical consequence relation, and that's the whole point of their pluralism, right? In the end, Rosanna's view, logical pluralism enable, right, to be logical pluralist and to honor this assumption about logic, right? And our argument proceeds in two steps, right? First, the lack of logical plurality argument, we're going to see how it goes, and second, a particular dilemma against the multiplicity of true logics. So you can think about the first one as an argument against kind of pure logics, right? The very idea of logical consequence relation. The second one, when you get to the applications, right? So then her attack goes on both sides. So the logical pluralist has no safe place to go, right? Whether you're pure logic or applied one, you're done, right? So I'm going to consider each of those considerations in turn, right? So now logical pluralists accept several logics, right? And then resist the need to choose among them. But what is in voting and accepting or endorsing, right? Primarily here, I'll be focusing for now on the pluralism by cases, which is the focus of Rosanna's criticism, right? So now, Biot and Rastel provide a distinction here about this idea of endorsing a logic. They say, well, we can strongly endorse a logic or weakly endorse it, right? You weakly endorse a logic when you consider that it offers an admissible instance of the generalized Tarski thesis, so it's an admissible logical consequence relation, but it doesn't satisfy an actuality constraint, right? The actuality constraint basically tells us that the actual case is in the domain of the quantifier that we are considering, right? So basically, here this is a logic that satisfied, you know, the notion of validity, but it's not, when you quantify overall the cases, the actual one is not among them. So you're just weakly endorsing the logic. Well, for you to strongly endorse the logic, just make sure that, you know, it's satisfied validity, but also the actuality constraint is there. So quantifying over the actual case among those under consideration. And very neatly, right, if you're a dialethiist, so you believe that there are true contradictions, it looks like you can strongly endorse logics that admit cases involving true contradictions, right? And while weakly endorsing classical logic, right? Because classical logic will have other things, right, that you can say, sure, yeah, they have it, they're just not considering the actual case. But once you have this actual case, which for the dialethists will be inconsistent situations, that generate true contradictions, then, okay, well, we have the strong endorsement. So far, so good. Then Rosanna does something that is really interesting. She says, okay, let's consider, however, that the actual case is consistent as opposed to what the big hopes from the dialethists. In that case, we get something very odd because the actual case will also be one of the cases quantify over within a paraconsistent logic, right? So someone who denies that there are any inconsistent situations can still strongly endorse the paraconsistent logician's consequence relation, as well as the classical one, right? So this is obviously a very unappealing asymmetry, right? Because the opponent, so think about the classical logician, right? Who doesn't want to have anything to do with a paraconsistent logic, right? So that logician would deny the existence of non-classical truth values. So, well, there are no values that are both true and false, but still you can count as strongly endorsing a paraconsistent logic, since the case they take to be the actual one, right, just be, you know, true or false, not both, right, is among the cases quantified over in a paraconsistent logic. So that's very odd, right? So you're forced to strongly endorse a logic you abhor, right? Okay, that's not good. All right. Now, then Rosanna goes further and says, it turns out that neither weak endorsement or strong endorsement do the trick, in any case, to flesh out what is to endorse a logic for the pluralist by cases, right? So here's the argument against weak endorsement. If the actual case is not in the domain of quantification, then the fact that an argument is truth-preserving in all cases quantify over does not even ensure that it's actually truth-preserving. A compelling normative constraint should rule this out. Right? So if you're considering all cases, but the actual case is not there, right, then you cannot even say that, look, yeah, this is truth-preserving because it satisfied validity, but not actually truth-preserving. So you cannot even say that, right? So then she says, consider how Bill and Russell put it early on. They say, if an argument is valid, then somehow you go wrong if you accept the premise but reject the conclusion, right? If, then Rosanna continues, if validity of an argument does not guarantee truth preservation in the actual case, then why think that you do go wrong in accepting the premises and denying the conclusion of a valid argument in the actual case? So that's embarrassing, right? So sure, you have truth preserving, but not the relevant one. You know? So clearly weak endorsement is too weak. All right, okay. Maybe the pluralist by case says, yeah, that's not the one. The real job is done with the strong endorsement. Well, it turns out that that's not better, right? Because although strong endorsement looks more promising, as the asymmetry pointed out above illustrates the one we just talked about, you count as strongly endorsing any logic contained within another logic that you endorse. For the weaker logic will automatically pass the actuality constraint if the former does, right? For example, you can count as strongly endorsing a paraconsistent logic while denying that there are or could be sentences that have non-classical truth value. That's exactly the situation of the classical logician, right? Without a stable account of endorsement of a logic, then it becomes unclear how a logical pluralist is in a position to endorse a plurality of logic. So the conclusion then is that the official statement of the pluralist by cases does not yield a form of pluralism about consequence. Okay, so you cannot be a pluralist in that way, right? Okay, someone may say, all right, yeah, but hey, the real business of pluralism is the application of logic. That's where the action is. All right, so she goes after, Rosanna goes after that and says, oh, here we have a dilemma, right? And that a dilemma is a dilemma against the idea of a multiplicity of true logics, right? So now we are applying that, right? Here's the way I reconstruct the dilemma, and then we're going to see, give some textual evidence. So don't say that I'm making this up, right? So as I said, the dilemma concerns the application of logics. In different kinds of application, either different logics will yield the right answer about logical consequence relative to a context, or the right answer hold for any context. So these are the options, right? None of them are good. If different logics provide the right logical consequence relation relative to a context, then this relation is relative. And the result is, well, relativism, which we saw Bew and Russell rejecting. Okay, so they cannot go that way. Alternatively, if different logics provide the right logical consequence relation in any context, then one can be a monist about such applications while considering other consequence relations adequate for pragmatic reasons. So, of course, if the application goes across the board, you just hold on to those cases. You say, okay, these are the real ones. The other ones may be useful for pragmatic reasons. It's just not the guide for the true one. But then you got monism, right? So basically, in this context, in different applications, either one, the pluralists end up being a relativist or a monist, right? None of the options are appealing for Bew and Russell. All right. So here's fleshing out as Rosanna presents it. On the first one, we maintain that in different types of application, different logics have the right answers about consequences. But this amounts to a relativist position, where the right logical consequence relation varies with and is thus relative to different contexts. As explained above, Bew and Russell deny that their pluralism is a form of relativism, since, as we saw, they say that we do not take logical consequence should be relative to languages, community of inquiry, context, or anything else. Then she says, how is this quotation compatible with the observation that how we should reason, which logic we should use, depends on the context. Okay, so that's bad. Second horn, this prompts the second horn of the dilemma, whereby any true consequence relation delivers a correct verdict in any context. But sometimes some choices are pragmatically more effective than others, right? For example, sometimes the simplicity of the propositional calculus helps in application. So for example, suppose you're a classical logician, you think that the right logic to be applied is, classical first-order logic, right? Propositional calculus, you say, well, we can get those things as a particular case, right? So you don't think that that's the real one, right? But you say, look, in many instances, it's actually helpful just to model the inferences propositionally, right? That's simpler, right? So use pragmatic reasons to use a logic that you don't think is the right one, while holding on to your commitment to the true logic, right? So the worry with this horn is that a candidate consequence relation can have certain sorts of applications without being a true consequence relation. Right? A monist can benefit from the simplicity of some systems that does not capture true consequence, and for example, trust its judgment of validity, but not all its judgments of invalidity. That's exactly what happened in the classical logician's case with propositional logic, right? If something is valid proposition, you say, yeah, that's good. If it's invalid proposition, you say, well, I'm not going to go that far because we need often richer logical structure to capture validity in quantificational cases. Now, Rosanna doesn't stop there, right? So those are the dilemma, right? And then she says, well, it turns out that the pluralist bike domains, the one that Scott and I favor, are not better, right? And so I'll lay out her concerns about that as well for the sake of completeness, right? I hate to be defensive, right? But I have to be fair. Okay, we present all the arguments, right? So here's her complaint. She says, that's the paper that I have, that we focus on uses of logic where what we should say is that stronger logics are useful for capturing something other than a consequence relation. So she said, well, the same move that, the pluralist by case, in criticizing the pluralist by cases would be, applied here, right? The modalist elements of their theory, the necessity is taken as primitive and not be understood in terms of quantification over cases, does not justify their claim that in different domains, different judgments of necessity are warranted. A database may represent a contradiction. This is an example we discussed in the paper. A student both has and has not returned some library books, right? And it can be useful to have a system whereby we can discriminate among the things that we can take this to commit us to. Perhaps that we owe a £3 fine, but not that they owe, 3,000 fine, £3,000 fine. As would also be true if it took an arbitrary conclusion that follows from the contradiction. But that's not to say that there's a sense of possibility in which it's possible that the student both has and hasn't returned the same books. It's possible for both he has returned the books and he has not returned the books to be recorded, but there's no contradiction there, and it is in a domain which he has both returned and not returned the books, right? I actually think she's right about that, but then she missed the relevant possibility, as I'll talk about it in a minute, right? We give a second example to try to motivate a different violation of double negation elimination, and she points out that, well, there's a problem there as well, right? And she says, similarly, the situation in which Bueno and Chalkovs judge a constructivist view to be warranted is in intentional context. It allows us to model, I'm not certain that the Yankees will not win the World Series as not P, where the inference to P, the Yankees will win, does not go through, right? So that's, again, an example that we gave in the paper. And she points out, but again, it doesn't give us a sense in which P fails to follow from not P, just a situation where a different correlated inference doesn't hold. And the concern that she brings is modeling the claim as not P does not make it a genuine instance of that form, right? So an interesting example of disagreement about logical form and how to formulate some translations from natural language into propositional language, right? And I'm willing to give her the point, though, right? There is a sense in which if you're going to be very strict, yes, this is not, an instance of it, right? We're playing fast and loose, but okay, the point's taken. I'll try to revamp the central idea in a moment. All right, so those are the concerns, right? So can we resist the challenge, right? First, a general remark, right? As noted, it was central for Rosanna's argument, the idea of a true logic, right? A logic that when applied to the world yields a true logical consequence relation, right? I think it's this commitment that compromises Beale and Rastall distinction between weak and strong endorsement of a logic, right? Which is expressing the actuality constraint. The actual case is the one corresponding to the true consequence relation. And that's where all the problems came in, right? Since the actual case is not involved, as we saw, right? The actual case is not involved in weak endorsement, a logic that argument need not be actually truth preserving. As we also saw, one strongly endorses any logic that is contained in the logic when it strongly endorses. But the weaker logic will automatically pass the actuality constraint if the former does. So the idea of having the true logic was crucial, right? For central steps of the argument, right? And then we saw the embarrassment that a classical logician would strongly endorse a per-consistent logic, right? However, the idea of a true logic plays no role in modalist logical pluralism, right? Logical consequence is a modal relation, not a relation of true preservation. So this is not an issue, right? Given the way that modalist logical pluralism was formed, right? So a linear argument that relies on a true logic would not get off the ground against the field. So that's a general complaint, right? Now, a second clarification. Of course, I'm not the one who's going to defend Beale and Rastall, right? I wish JC was here so he could, could hear his side of the story. But okay, that's not to be, right? I actually think that Rosanna's challenge against their view is effective. I think those are serious difficulties, and it seems to me that they do undermine the account, right? But since the modalist logical pluralism I favor is importantly different from the pluralism by cases, as I already tried to suggest, and given that we reject the pluralism by cases in motivating our own, right? What I'm going to do now is say, okay, can a modalist, a logical pluralist, avoid the objections, right? So I'm going to speak on that behalf. All right. So let's go, by the various arguments that we consider, right? So the first step of Rosanna's argument is the lack of logical plurality argument, right? Now, on the modalist approach to logical pluralism, there's no commitment to weak or strong endorsement, right? The view is just, that's not the way that things are set up. But the adequacy of a logic is determined relative to the modal features of the domain. As I tried to say, look, if you in a non-relativistic quantum domain, right, it's just not possible to keep the theory as it's formulated plus distributivity. You get an impossibility at that point. These are the possibilities that are constraining which logic is adequate, right? So quantum logics, not surprisingly, are all non-distributive, so that they do not face that kind of constraint, that it's a constraint coming from the domain. So the adequacy comes from modal properties of the domain, right? Not issues about truth preservation or the actuality case and so on. So a logic that properly reflects the modal relations in question is adopted, and any other logic that sanctions the same inferences in that context is equally adequate for the task at hand. So in that sense, the pluralism that I favor is, massive pluralist in a way. So given a domain, often there is a plurality of logics for that same domain. These are logics that will sanction the same inferences for that domain. They may disagree elsewhere, right? So there is a sense in which it doesn't matter which of these logics you're applying when you're considering the domain in question, right? So, so here's an example, right? So, although classical logic is violated in a quantum domain for non-relativistic quantum mechanics, there are several quantum logics that will be appropriate for that domain. Some are pair-consistent, others are not, right? Some are non-reflexive, others are not, right? But all of them are non-distributive, right? All of them actually preserve the relevant possibilities in that domain, and that's what's at issue here. So given the lack of commitment to the sort of weak and strong endorsement, right? That side of the argument, I don't think affects the modalist logical pluralist. How about the second step, right? The dilemma, right? That we saw, right? The first horn, recall, says if different logics provide the right logical consequence relation relative to a context, then this relation is relative and the result is relativism, right? Which Pew and Ralph reject. I think this is right. You do get relativism, right? But as noted, the modalist logical pluralist has no problem embracing this form of benign relativism. I think, yeah, logical consequence is relative to the context. That's the whole idea of the view, right? I think the real threat here is radical relativism, according to which there is no independent standard to determine whether a logical consequence relation can be applied or not, right? And anything goes. That would be a big problem if held, right? But radical relativism, I think, is resisted, right? Given the modal properties of the domain in question, right? Certain logics are adequate to the domain, right? They preserve in the sense they respect, right, the relevant possibilities, while others are inadequate, right? So I illustrate, cases in which classical logic is inadequate to accommodate a quantum domain, whether in non-reflexive context or just regular non-relativistic ones. And so it's not the case that anything follows, right? In fact, classical logic applies to a number of domains, right? In fact, in retrospect, it should be surprising that anyone would think that a classical logic, that is great in every respect, in so many respects, that was designed by hand, by Frege, to accommodate primarily abstract objects in the foundations of mathematics, should be applicable across the board, right? Who would think that, right? So I think that's the problem, right? So of course, and again, the major lessons from non-classical logics was to realize the limitations of that. A logic that is great to think about abstract objects may not be great at all to think about vague things, to think about things that may not have identity, to think about things that have indeterminacy, all of those things, right? It may prevent you from expressing the logical relations you want to express and need to express. Once you have that, that's a good reason to change the logic, right? So the idea is we don't get the radical relativism, right? Because for some contexts, some logic is adequate. In fact, several are, right? Inadequate in others, right? Now, the second horn of the dilemma. If different logics provide the right logical consequence relation in any context, then one can be a monist about such applications while considering other consequence relations adequate for pragmatic reasons, right? Now, I think here, the model is one to resist the antecedent, right? Namely, the idea is no logic provides the right consequence relation in any context, right? That kind of logical universalism is the one that I was just complaining a minute ago about Frege, right? Since pretty much every logical principle has been violated in some context, right? So I think that's what needs to go, right? So, and certainly in the form of pluralism that I defend, that's a feature of the view. So I wouldn't grant the antecedent. Now, there's some interesting features that follow once you do that, right? Because now logic is no longer topic neutral, right? Sure, there was an ideal we had about logic, right? Before we knew better, right? And depending on the context, certain logical principles simply will not go through, right? That makes logic look much closer to models in science, right? Who would think that a model should be applicable across the board, the entire universe, right? Nothing works like that, right? The world is too damn complicated for any model to be substantive, informative, and make sense of everything, right? Of course, when physicists talk about theories of everything, of course, there's no such theory, but even if there were, there would not be theories about everything. There would be theories about physics, right? So they have nothing to say about pediatrics, right? And so the adequacy of an applied logic is then a domain-dependent affair, right? That's a central feature of the view. And because of that, then the idea that we have a consequence relation that is applicable to any context doesn't go through, right? Certainly not on that view. All right, finally, the direct challenge that was raised against the modalist logical pluralism, right? As we saw, she pointed out that modalist elements of the account does not justify the claim that in different domains, different judgments of necessity are warranted, right? So then considering the database that includes a contradiction to the fact that a student both return and not return some library books, she notes, that's not to say that there is a sense of possibility in which it's possible that the student both has and has not returned the same books, right? I think this is exactly right, right? Surely no one can possibly both return and not return. Of course, I'm not a dialethics. And in fact, I think even Grand Prix will grant that no one can do that. But who knows? I'm not speaking for him, right? So I don't think that there's no possibility here, right? So when I talk about what are the possibilities here, right? The possibilities in question is a different one, right? So faced with a contradiction in the database, so we do have the student has returned and the database has not, so we have that contradiction. They're faced with that. What do we do, right? Well, if you're reasoning with classical logic, you're done. Everything follows. End of game, right? So the idea, however, is, look, obviously we know that no student can both return and not return the books. So one of those pieces of information needs to go, perhaps both, right? Which should we do? So what we need here is a logic that would allow us to reason through an inconsistency without triviality. That's the possibility that classical logic forecloses. It doesn't allow us to do that because it identifies contradiction with triviality. Or contradiction, everything follows, right? So in order to investigate the issue without arbitrarily rejecting one or both pieces of information, which is what we have to do with classical logic, right? Okay, faced with a contradiction, well, we need to give up one or the other. We have no idea where to start, and we cannot reason on those things because the thing is inconsistent, right? You can reason by arbitrarily picking one piece. It's okay, let's eliminate the contradiction, but just rejecting one. But why this one, right? On what basis, right? So what you need is a logic that recognizes the possibility that a contradiction does not entail everything. Well, that's exactly the possibility that classical logic forecloses and a pair consistent logic explore, right? So that's the possibility that allows one to reason without triviality about the database and try to determine which piece of information needs to go. But that's the idea, right? The possibilities in question that are involved there are possibilities about reason through an inconsistency, right? And the beauty here is that also illustrates how you can be a paraconsistent logician, but need not be a dialethist, right? You reason about an inconsistency without assuming that some of them are true, right? You can be completely agnostic about that. In fact, I haven't talked about truth, right? On the modalist picture. It's not even part of the view. Now, the second criticism, right? I think Rosanna is right? Remember, she notes, modeling the claim, I'm not certain that Yankees will not win the World Series as not P does not make it a genuine instance of the form because, of course, you have an intentional context, right? I'm not certain. I'm not just negating a proposition and negating a proposition that it's about a certain epistemic state, right? Point taken, right? All right. I want to be very strict. She's right. I'm not going to argue with that. In fairness, we're trying to give, not to get an overly technical example, right? And try to say, can you give something that this was for mind, right? We said, look, we don't want to, throw, we're already talking about, inconsistencies, but okay, didn't work. All right, point taken. So can we do better, right? So here's a different way, right? So getting the point that we're trying to do, maybe without that concern, right? Think about constructive mathematics, right? And think about with the intuitionistic interpretation for the connectives, right? So that intuitionistic interpretation talks about proofs, right? Because that's what it's at the core and the central attention for the intuitionistic logician. So the negation of A is interpreted as the derivation of not A, right? So when you have not A, you have a derivation of a contradiction, right? Is the way of understanding the negation of A. So a derivation of a contradiction from not P would not yield a proof of P, right, on that setting, because you need to actually have a direct construction of P and none was offered, right? Now, that was exactly the point that from the semantics, not P cannot infer P, right? And that was important because what the intuitionistic logician was trying to do is to carve up, right, a possibility that was foreclosed by classical logic, right? Namely, the possibility of constructive proofs, right? So proofs that would need to construct the properties of the object in order to determine that the object does have those properties, rather than just obtaining indirectly by saying, look, the negation of this property led to a contradiction, therefore the thing obtains. And we have no idea why the thing obtains, right? And that's what the constructivists would bother about, right? So think about the axiom of choice, right? The axiom, if it holds, then every set will be well-ordered, right? Including a set like the set of the reals, right? There will be a good order. We have no idea what a order will be for such set, but there is one, according to classical mathematics. This is the kind of thing that the constructivist was saying, look, we need to do better, right? But that's not a possibility that you can entertain if the underlying logic is classical, right? Because of inferences like double negation elimination. So that's the idea that we are trying to present in that paper, but fail to present, with the Yankees. All right. So to conclude, I think two forms of logical pluralism were contrasted, one by cases, one by domains. Right? I think Rosanna's critique of pluralism by cases is effective. Right? It goes through. And I try to indicate why the modalist logical pluralism, the pluralist by domains, is in principle in a position to avoid these various objections. So in that sense, I suggest, maybe I suggest enough to indicate that one way in which logical pluralism can be, right, a modal domain-dependent way. Thank you very much.
Will be pressed forward. Now we open the floor for some questions.
Thank you, Antonio. I just have a question about the concept of domain and whether it invites or prevents some type of radical relativism.
Right.
So the idea is, I don't know whether you have a clear characterization of what counts as a domain, because if not, then there is the problem that almost everything can be a domain, right? And so you can use logic to make sense of things that shouldn't be making sense, and then saying, okay, this logic works very good in this domain, and structure something that is not a structure, and so the logic is making a work of confusing us in a sense, and so ideally that's not the normative work of logic, right? So it should help us to identify some errors in reasoning, and now you are legitimating those errors according to a particular logical framework. So that's one of my concerns. Another one would be that the same episode, in a sense, can be reconstructed in different ways, creating different domains. So you say this this particular episode illustrates errors and how to prevent multiplying the errors, right? So it's a view that you might have about contradictions, for instance. So if you commit to a certain type of adaptive logic, then you know that a contradiction is a mistake, and then you mark it, you can reason from that or around that, but that doesn't mean that you legitimate that contradiction, right? So the possibilities that you allow in that context are different from the ones that if you are a dialecticist and you see a contradiction over there, then you create or interpret that particular case or episode or whatever as a different domain, a domain that legitimates the presence of contradictions. So that's the problem about inviting radical relativism. But on the other hand, if you say, yes, I do have a clear criteria of what comes as a domain, then my worry might be that you are excluding some practices or that you are preferring, I think Shapiro's pluralism is like that. So you prefer certain types of reasoning practices as indicative of whatever is going to motivate the pluralism.
Right.
I was wondering.
Perfect. No, those are great points, right? So, yeah, of course, the notion of a domain, I'm not giving you a sharp boundary about it, right? And deliberately so, because often we don't know what these domains are, how far they extend. We have some ideas. They are thought of as domains of inquiry, right? So you're investigating certain things. Well, primarily, that's what sort of the most interesting domains are of that sort. And now, we often don't know how far those things expand, right? Again, in the case of scientific theories, right? So Newton once thought, and lots of people also thought, that the domain of classical physics will be the entire universe, right? And then learned the hard way that this is not the case, right? And then the domain was restricted, right? So I don't think that there is an a priori way of specifying in advance, here are the domains, because those things are changing, right? And they change as new information about the subject matters that we are studying unfold, right? And so now you say, well, then we can just pick and choose whatever we do, right? Well, we can, but I'm not sure that we will create interesting domains, right? We say, well, this is my domain, right? I'm just thinking about anything my mother-in-law says, right? And I'm going to understand her reasoning. Sure, you can reason about that, right? So the question is how significant it is in terms of, designing a logic for that, right? My idea is the following. I don't think you start by designing a logic, right? On the contrary, right? You look at the domain and you start to understanding what properties it has. Usually we start, of course, and then you say, well, we need to reason about those things. What do we do, right? Well, we start with the logics we have, right? Classical logic has much going for it. You start with classical logic, right? So, and then you see how far you can go. Of course, if you can go all the way, great, you don't change, right? Now, there are changes of logic that are blatantly ad hoc, right? You cannot just, so I say something that is contradictory, right? And then you point that out to me and said, oh, no, that's not a problem. I'm going to change the logic. It's paraconsistent and I'm okay, right? That's unacceptable, right? I gave you examples of, what takes to change a logic. Those things are not taken lightly, right? So notice, right? I said, look, the logic that we're going to extract, right, from the domain is constrained by the relevant modal properties of that domain, right? So the features that we are trying to make sense. So there are substantive issues, right? So I resist, for example, a tradition that unfortunately several logicians have of just cooking up logics, and I say, well, what's the point of that exercise? And sometimes they cook up the logic and then they look for applications. And if you're just doing a piece of pure logic, of course you can do whatever you want, right? But this seems to be just the wrong way to approach things, right? It would be similar to, I'm going to cook up a physics, right? Without bothering, look, anything in the world. And then I cook up 27,000 different physics. And then I say, okay, let's see whether they apply, right? That's I think, it would be similarly ill-advised, right? So I do think that there are, of course, at this point, we have a rich context of logics, are ready to invoke. Maybe we may uncover new ones, but out of the domain. So it's important that domains have priority in that, right? So, and I do think the domains have to have some significance, right? So that it's not just a tiny little, domain of consideration. Now, then you ask, look, how about the fact that, you may actually have different logics to account for the same domain, right? And now the example you gave, I thought was interesting, right? Between a dialethist and, an adaptive logician. Interestingly, both invoke a paraconsistent logic. They might be different paraconsistent logics, but both are paraconsistent. They are both dealing with a domain that involves contradictions, right? Now, their disagreement, I don't think is a disagreement about the domain, right? It's about an interpret. So it's also not necessarily even about the logic. Like they're disagreeing about the interpretation of the logic.
Elements that restrict the possibilities of that.
No. An interpretation is a piece of philosophical gloss. You're adding something, right? When Grand Prix says, look, here's explosion, right? What it allows you to do is to reason about things that are true, right? And he's adding a particular philosophical gloss to a rule of inference. This is not logic. This is metaphysics, something else, right? I don't think that that's what shapes and constrains the domain, right? As a good empiricist, I'm very worried about adding layers of metaphysical interpretation about things. I think often they are very misleading. See, I will start the talk talking about Lewis, right? The way that I think possible world mislead us into taking, for example, possibilities too easily, right? Sure, can pigs fly? Of course, I can imagine, there's a world in which, a pig is flying, right? Well, pigs are very non-aerodynamic, bulky, heavy things. Putting, wings in it would not make these creatures fly, right? If you say, oh no, but there's a world in which pigs are made out of feathers. Yeah, these are not pigs. So my concern is, this is an example of a certain metaphysical gloss about an important notion, possibility, that distorts what this notion is about, right? So I want to say that in many cases, the added metaphysical claims are distorting features, right? So I'm not going to squeeze them into the domains. In fact, I'm going to extract them out and I try to understand what the real relevant modal properties are, right? Of course, I'm talking about modal properties. Don't get all excited. These are not instantiated universals. These are not set of instances of possible worlds, right? Take properties before you consider any philosophy class, right? These are just features of things, right? This table has a shape, right? It's a property. That's all I need when I'm talking about a modal property. All right, thank you.
There's 5 minutes left.
Oh, boy.
We have
Sorry.
for one question.
Okay, thank you so much, Otávio, for your talk. I have two quick questions. The first one concerns your response of the second floor. You said that the monist establishes a distinction between the adequacy of logic and the application of logic, thereby conceiving of applied logics as a mere extension of the single one, true or correct logic. My question is, if we consider the adequacy of a logic as determined by the modal properties, as your pluralism suggests, is still there a distinction between criteria for the true or the adequacy of logic and the application of logic in pragmatic terms? That's the question.
Yeah. So let me say one thing about that briefly. And because I resist cashing this out as a claim about truth, right? And you can always do that, but I think that that's unnecessary, right? So the adequacy, the thing about the example I gave in the quantum mechanics case, right? A logic that preserves distributivity, right, would not be, it will just be ruled out because it's incompatible, right, with the other assumptions by the theory that constrains the domain in question, right? So in that sense, a logic adequate to it would actually, what that means, no more than it's a logic that it's possible given the features of the domain in question, right? The modal properties of it. In that case, one in which distributivity cannot be held to hold, right? And so that's, I don't think we need more than that, right? So to then make sense of the application, right? Several logics would be adequate for that, right? And that's okay, right? And they'll disagree elsewhere, right? And then for that domain, they'll do the trick.
Point concerns the distinction you draw between tolerant relativism and radical relativism.
Right.
I am not sure whether there is a substantive distinction between the two as you formulated them. Because to say that there is not independent standard to determine whether logical consequence relation can be applied or not seems to be equal to say that logical consequence is relative to something. I mean, we have here the dependence condition of relativism.
Yeah.
And if there is no distinction between tolerant relativism and radical relativism, my further concern is what is the argument to conclude that the acceptance of the dependence condition leads to anything goes. I mean that we need to introduce more conditions in order to say, for instance, that any logic is completely valid. For instance, to be an anti-realist concerning normative facts, a la field, for instance. But I don't see how, if I accept that logic is dependent on frameworks or and so on and so forth, leads to anything goes. What's the argument?
First, I don't think that the weaker form of relativism entails a radical one, right? Because consider this, right? The only thing that the weak form is saying is that, to specify a logic, right, or the application, you need to be sensitive to the context to which it is applied, right? And I think you do, right? Think about the example, right, of the violation of distributivity. That doesn't go through in the case of classical mathematics, right? Their distributivity is perfectly fine, right? But it's problematic in the quantum case, right? So then there's a sense in which the sort of relativity that I talk about, it's a relative to those domains. And those domains have a bunch of modal properties. They have constraining features, right, that will rule out certain things, right? So, and because they rule out certain things, certain logics are going to be ruled out, and so it's not the case that everything goes. Certain logics will just be inadequate, right? They're incompatible with modal properties of the domain, right? So in that way, you resist, going radical, right? So the two features is the modal structures of the domains that constrain things, and then because of that, they rule out certain logics, right? But do not rule out all, right? There will be others that will be perfectly fine in that domain that will end up being ruled out, with some other domain. Okay.
So there's time for 2 more questions.
I have a probably very dumb question, but isn't there a possibility of mixed domains, or how would you handle that? Let's suppose that you have like a classical domain and a quantum domain that requires dropping distributivity, or right? But then you have a macro domain. How would you handle the possibility of mixed domains?
Yeah, well, remember, not every problem is a problem of application of logic, right? Often the problem is not with the logic, it's whatever theoretical assumptions you have about the domain. And those get priority, right? As I said, you don't keep changing the logic just, as you change socks, right? Because you want to understand the domain. And the part of the understanding of the domain is mediated by several accounts that you have of those. Sometimes, you might be forced to revise those things on empirical grounds or conceptual grounds, right? So now, of course, certain mixed, domains, as you say, are just not possible, right? So if you say, look, once distributivity goes, you can no longer apply classical logic, at least not the full classical logic. You might be able to apply other fragments of classical logic that are independent from distributivity, right? So if you want to be, I want to use as much of it as I can, and you can do something, because at that point, the distributivity was ruled out, right? And so in that case, that logic, the full classical logic, is no longer an option there, right? But there'll be several others that actually would agree with a bunch of things that classical logic would also agree, but do not violate distributivity, right? Several quantum logics are like that, right? Some quantum logics are explosive, right? In that way, they would agree with features from classical logic. But there are non-explosive quantum logics, right? So that would be a case in which, okay, suppose I'm dealing with a domain that is quantum and inconsistent, right? So, well, if you have good reasons to think that that's what it's called for, then a paraconsistent quantum logic would be appropriate. But again, I insist, logic is not the tool of solving problems, right? You don't start with those things, right? You revise the logic as needed, right? So you don't keep changing the logic as problems emerge, right? Otherwise, it would be very ad hoc.
There any more questions?
So forgotten. I have a million. But I think the only one that we have time for is, couldn't there be what's the name of the argument? The collapse argument. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Couldn't we formulate a collapse argument that goes neither to true nor acceptance or what follows, but just to what is possible? So that if you say that things are possible only relative to domains, and we just run the argument and say, well, yeah, but I want to know just what is possible, not what is possible in the domain, and how can this now new relative notion play the role that you want to give it, so that it still gives valid for consequences.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Of course, we have to see, right? We have to think about what the argument look like so we can see whether it goes through or not, right? But the idea is, of course, the possibilities are sensitive to the various features, right, that we are considering, right? And so, some of the modal properties of this table will also change depending on the environment where it is, right? If you take it to the moon, we may start floating around, and so there are where it doesn't hear, right? So we need to be sensitive to those things, right? And in that sense, it's not obvious to me that you have a possibility, right? This notion that is completely independent and free floating, right? So I think it's all. Look, this is all localized, right? So it's features of specific things, right? Well, maybe this is an artifact of the way I think as an empiricist, right? Where empiricists tend to be very skeptical of sort of very global, systematic, unified. They tend to crash and burn, right? And so I feel much more safe considering, little things, case by case, working through them, seeing how they go, expand as far as you go, and realizing the limitations. And I think that's life. Right? In fact, that's how we all live our lives. Right? It's not very different in this respect. You're welcome. Thank you.